So that's a fascinating gospel story, but I kind of covered that part of it last week. So if you missed it, you can watch it. I think it's posted on our website. I talk about the gospel lesson. But this week, I'd actually like to talk about the first reading, the reading from 1 Corinthians. There was this famous theologian who once compared the story of the Bible, the story of Jesus, the gospel, to a well of water because it can kind of sustain us spiritually. But he made this observation about it when he said, you know, a lot of times when we look into this well of the gospel, all we end up seeing is our own reflection. And what he meant by this is that we tend to create a God in our own image. We tend to assume, it's just kind of a human thing, that God agrees with us, right? It's like, of course God is on my side and for my group and not for the group that I'm not part of. And of course God dislikes the things I dislike. What else would he do, right? And of course he supports the things I support. And of course if there was an election, God would vote like me. And of course if there was a hard choice, God would choose like me. It's sort of part of being human that we tend to view our own perspectives as better and wiser than the other ones that disagree with us. Well, there's this story about an American church a number of years ago that was trying to develop this missionary relationship with this village in Africa. And so they went out, they had this visit with this tribe in Africa, which lived a very traditional lifestyle. And in this tribe, the women didn't wear anything on the top halves of their body because it was a very hot climate. And for their culture, you know, the top half of a woman's body was just not taboo. So they didn't wear anything up there. And these American folks, when they visited this tribe, you know, were just appalled at what they saw as this horrible tragedy of poverty that was not allowing these women to dress fully. And so they went home and they decided, without consulting their African friends, that they would do a bra drive in their church. And so they did. They collected hundreds of bras. They put them in some big boxes. They shipped them off to this village. And you know, some time passed. They weren't able to go back right away. But sometime later, they returned. They went to this village to visit their friends, excited to see what they were going to see with the progress that would be made through their gift. And so they arrived at this village, and they saw that all the women were still not wearing tops. And so they started talking to one of them, and they said, "Did you receive the packages we sent you?" And this woman said, "Yes, we did." And then she opened up this pocket on her pants, and in there was a bra cup sewn in. And she said, "Thank you so much. These make the best pockets." Apparently, this is a true story. But this, of course, is a story of a misunderstanding. But I would argue that the ones who really misunderstood weren't the tribe who didn't ask for this kind of help. It was the silly Americans who went over and assumed that they understood something that they didn't really understand and that they hadn't really put in the work to understand. Well, on a similar note, this can be our issue when we hear the gospel, when we read the Bible, and when we encounter different words in the Bible. We don't always understand what they mean, or at least fully understand what they mean. And one example of this is the word love. We assume that it means what we mean by it, and we assume that God's love is basically the same as our love. Well, over and against this is the actual Bible, which does not assume that human beings are very good at comprehending what God's love is like. And that's Paul's standpoint, St. Paul's standpoint, as he writes in Corinthians that we heard today about love. He assumes that it's not good enough to just say love. He assumes that he needs to define it because we may not understand what it's all about. And he assumes that because he's actually writing to a community that has been devastated by conflict. The community we're talking about is a church, an early church in the city of Corinth, which is an ancient city in the southern half of modern-day Greece. And you know, we Christians often have this idea, we often assume that things would be so much better in the church if we only returned to the good old days of the early church, right? The ancient church where they had everything figured out and they were super close to Jesus' teachings and they just lived things good. And we have this idea that back then people agreed and people always got along and always showed love to each other. So we just need to turn back the clock and go back to those days. Well, let me tell you, if you read the books of Corinthians, Corinthians 1 or Corinthians 2, you quickly realize that the ancient church was no utopia. In fact, Paul writes these letters to the Corinthians largely because this, like I said, is a community of conflict where love is not coming easily. Love is coming at a terrible price. It's been very hard for these people, or maybe to say it's not being shared very well. In one case, in the book of Corinthians, he talks about the practices around communion, the Lord's Supper, in this community. And they were doing it in this really messed up way. The richer folks were having a feast. So like we do just a ceremonial meal, right, with a little bit of bread and a little bit of wine or something. They were having an actual feast, which would be fine, except for that the rich folks were secretly showing up early, having this giant feast, getting drunk on the wine, and then eating all the food. And by the time the poorer folk came to the sanctuary, there was nothing left. And they wouldn't have anything. So, I mean, a pretty messed up way to do communion. And it gets even weirder. In another place in Corinthians, Paul has to reprimand the community because there's this guy who's having an improper relationship with his own stepmother, right? So if you ever have a conflict in your church, don't worry, we're doing okay. We're not the Church of Corinthians. So again, we can put away this fantasy that the early period of the church was this time when everything was perfect. Because clearly these early Christians had disagreements and conflicts and problems just like us. So in this setting, here's St. Paul. And legend has it he was actually the founder of the church in Corinth. But he's no longer there. He was always journeying around doing different ministry in different places. And he's somewhere else far away. He's not able to come in person. And so all he can do is write a letter. They had very good mailing in the Roman Empire. So he writes a letter to this church to try to help them, to try to correct this hurting community. And so he says a lot of things. He focuses first at what the gospel is and how they need to focus on that. And then in this section, in Corinthians 13, he decides to remind them of what is most important in their lives and in their community, which is love. And he starts out by talking about, like we said in the children's sermon, how you can possess any number of things that would normally be wonderful and beneficial, right? You can be intelligent, you can be powerful, you can be wise, you can have great talent, whatever, any number of blessings you can have. But he says if these things aren't done in the spirit of love, if they're not done in service to love, then they just don't matter, not at all. In fact, we could say that if they're not used in the service of love, it's worse than that they don't matter. They'll probably be destructive, right? Because intelligence used for evil can be a horrible thing, right? And how many times have we experienced this reality, right? Where if it's not done in the spirit of love, it doesn't matter. I know I have. I mean, have you ever gotten into a fight? And usually we get into fights with our own loved ones, right? The people we care about most. And at first, the fight is about some issue, some disagreement. You didn't do this, or you said that, or whatever it is. But pretty soon, both sides get angry. Both sides lose control. And for a little while, we have to admit, love goes out the window. Maybe people say something they regret. And before long, the big issue isn't whatever the issue was originally. It's the fight itself, right? The bigger problem is the fight. Which is to say, the bigger problem is the lack of love that's taken place in the fight. And at that point, whatever was originally right or wrong doesn't really matter so much, at least not for a while, until the more fundamental thing is restored, which again is love. Well, that's Paul's theme here, that in life and in our relationships, love actually matters more than anything else. And so he goes on in this kind of beautiful section to describe what love is like when it's real. And he's talking about what kind of love God has given us, and therefore we can share with each other. And he lifts up different aspects of love when it's real. He talks about patience, he talks about kindness and humility and selflessness and forgiveness and truthfulness. It's this really powerful section. And if we think about power, one of the mistakes we make as we think about love is we often turn it into something cute, right? Like a Hallmark card, something kind of weak, something that maybe is nice but doesn't do that much in the world. But that's not what Christian love is like, says St. Paul. Christian love has power. Martin Luther King Jr., who we recently celebrated his day, he based his whole civil rights movement on Christian love, right? We forget that it was founded on Christian love. And he once said this about this dynamic between power and love. He said, power without love is reckless and abusive, right? We know that, right? Evil power is reckless and abusive. But he also said, love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love, right? Power correcting everything that stands against love. You know, one of the powers of love is that it can bring together people who wouldn't normally share a table. And you know, I think this is by Jesus' own design. You know, most groups who join together, we join together because we're very similar in one way or another. But the church, right, which is people, not a building, it's the community of Christ. From the beginning, it's been about creating community between all different kinds of people, sometimes people who are very different, and we're not centered around the fact that we're the same on everything. We're centered around God's love. And this God's love can bring together, again, people who wouldn't normally be one. You know, I dare not do this. You'd be crazy to do it nowadays. But, you know, we could go through all the controversial issues in society right now, and we could do a little vote. Where do you stand on this, right? For it or against it? And I bet if we did this, what we would discover is that in our own room right now, we don't agree on everything. We're not always of the same mind. We don't always think our community should do the same thing about different issues. We're not all the same, but maybe that's the point. In confirmation this past Wednesday, we watched one of these great videos called The Bible Project. You can find it online on YouTube. But they make these videos about Jesus' ministry. And in this video, it talked about how Jesus' ministry with his disciples was pretty much one of a kind in that day because it was bringing together people of different types, you know, people of different social classes, different backgrounds. Among Jesus' own 12 disciples were people who normally would have been not just different, but people who would have been enemies. It lifted up, for instance, how one of the disciples, his name was Matthew, or sometimes he's called Levi, he had been a tax collector. And if you were a tax collector in this day, this meant that you were a tax collector for the Romans who ruled that area, right? They had conquered the Israelites, and they were the occupiers. And so a tax collector collected taxes on behalf of the enemy that was oppressing your people. And so this person, Matthew, in his former life, would have been seen as a collaborator, someone who'd betrayed his own people, would have been hated by most everybody. And yet, in the same group is the kind of person who would have hated him the most, a guy called Simon the Zealot. And Simon the Zealot refers to a radical revolutionary. And in this day, a revolutionary was an Israeli revolutionary whose goal was to overthrow the conquering Romans, right? So someone who wanted to get rid of the Romans and overthrow them by violence if necessary. And yet, in Jesus' movement, in his discipleship group, these two are called to put away their divisions and become one. And they're called to embody the love that they've received from Jesus that goes beyond just loving people who are close to you and similar to you. In fact, Jesus once said, maybe we've heard this, and I paraphrase, but he said, you know, who cares if you just love the people who are close to you and similar to you, right? He says that's nothing special. Everyone loves the people who are close to them and similar to them. He says Christian love kicks in when it's the other, right? When it's the sinner, when it's the outcast, when it's the enemy, when it's the person who disagrees with all the things you believe in. So St. Paul reminds us, Jesus reminds us today, that the reason we're here, the reason we are the church, is to embody a community that's different. It's to embody a community that loves differently from the rest of the world because we have been loved differently too. God has loved us despite all our problems, and so he calls us to love each other despite our issues and differences. And this love we share in Christ, we remember today, isn't weak. It's strong. It heals divisions. It forgives wrongdoing. It lifts up the hurting. It overcomes disagreement and conflict. And ultimately, it leads us towards life. And so this week, I invite you to reflect on this message that St. Paul gives us, to kind of pray it as a prayer, maybe a mantra for the week, is this message: God's love in all and God's love above all. God's love in all and God's love above all. Amen. Let's rise and continue in song.